I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I was an Ivy League history major. And I knew absolutely nothing about African history. Absolutely nothing. And so when I got to the Sierra Leone Grammar School, which was the best secondary school in West Africa, they said, well, you're going to teach African history. I got out of that. But I did have to teach a lower level of African history. And the result was that I spent the rest of my life, and still do it, learning about African history and also learning about African American history and culture. And I have to introduce one of my teachers, my wife Patricia, who's from Aiken, South Carolina. And she has been to Freetown, and she fell in love with it. Good deal.
Yeah.
For me, this book is kind of closing the circle that began in 1963, because when I went there, I knew nothing about Africa. I knew nothing about African history or culture. I certainly knew nothing about Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone taught me many, many things and got me interested in things that have changed my life. And this book is my gift back to Sierra Leone. It tells a story about one of the country's heroes that had never been written about before. And it's the least I can do to thank Sierra Leone and the people for what they gave me. What they gave me, among other things, was hospitality to begin with. That is a strong trait in Africa. It doesn't matter where you go on the continent. You will be welcomed as a stranger. And that is something that I think, well, those of you who've been there know this, but those who are going for the first time, you'll experience that. And it's special. And all you have to do is be yourself. Have a sense of humor. That's another thing that you're taught in Sierra Leone. Not so?
That's true.
So why did I write this book? I mentioned that I had embarked on this sort of lifelong study of African history and African culture, and also African American culture and history. And one of the things that I was studying back in the 70s was the colonization movement. Do you all know what that was?
Sure.
Okay. And that's how I discovered John Kissel. Because John Kissel, although he was born in Sierra Leone and was brought to Charleston, enslaved in 1773, just before the Revolution, the American Revolution, he became the point person in Africa, in West Africa, for the American Colonization Society. And that dates back to 1818, 1819, 1820. The way that happened, I don't want to go into great detail in this book, but this book does tell a history that has never before been explained. And I urge all of you, one way or the other, to get a hold of this and read it. Hopefully before you go, because there's a lot in here that you will find relevant to the experience that you're going to have. Now, what makes John Kissel so remarkable is that when he arrived in Charleston, he was a small 13-year-old boy, and that saved his life, because if you were an adult male and you were taken off the ship, you almost certainly were going to end up on a rice or indigo plantation. The mortality rate in 1 year was a third of the workforce on those plantations. So if he had ended up on a plantation, this book wouldn't be here, and he wouldn't have lived very long. he was purchased by a widow in Charleston who was running an inn. We can't be sure, but we think that she had some role in making sure that he was able to learn to read and write. So by the time he was 20 years old, in 1780, he was literate, fully literate. And when the British took Charleston in the Revolution in 1780, like many other African slaves, he joined the British Army. And he was with the British commander of the Loyalist force at the Battle of Kings Mountain, which was one of the pivotal battles of the American Revolution. He was the only known black man at that battle on the Loyalist side. When the British lost the Revolution, he and 3,000 others were evacuated from New York City in 1783 mostly to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, some to Bermuda, some actually managed to go to Europe. 10 years later, the people who had been evacuated there and resettled were offered the opportunity to go to Africa. Now, Kissel was one of the few among these people who had been born in Africa. So he ends up going back to his homeland. Very few people who were brought across the Atlantic as slaves made it back to Africa. He did. And because he was literate, he wrote about his experiences in trying to get his people to stop trade in slaves. And I stumbled across his reports and letters which he had written to the British governor in 1811, 1812. And they go into great detail about how the slave trade was being conducted along the coast of Sierra Leone. That is why Amadou early on mentioned the legacy of the slave trade. No one has ever sat down in Sierra Leone and said, look, we have a problem. We have all of these communities strung along the coast and some inland that were affected by the slave trade 200 and 300 years ago. We don't know what the impact on the culture was. And I make the case in this book, and I think Amadou and others make the case that the time has come when Sierra Leoneans, for their own good, need to figure out what the impact was on the cultures along the coast. I unfortunately believe that the civil war that occurred in Sierra Leone in the 1990s is related in part at least to what happened during the years of the slave trade. And that's discussed in the latter stage of this book. I'm going to stop there, and perhaps some of you have questions about this, but this book, by the way, is published by the University of South Carolina Press, and we're hoping ultimately to make a documentary film based on this book. A documentary film, yeah. Anyway, I'm looking forward to going with you. This will probably be my last trip to Sierra Leone. I'm one of the oldest people in this group, I think, if not the oldest. But I've been to all of the places that you will be visiting, and it's going to be a lot of fun and a real education. So I thank you in that. I didn't speak much Creole when I was living in Sierra Leone, but I learned some. Unfortunately for me, the language is always changing, evolving. So, now one other thing about John Kissel, by the way, he is considered in Liberia as one of their founding fathers. even though he never set foot in Liberia. The first African Americans to go to Sierra Leone go to West Africa under the colonization movement arrived in his village in 1820. And if things had gone well with the negotiations with the chiefs, those people would have ended up being settled in what is now Sierra Leone, not Liberia. Things did not go well with the negotiations, and they ended up going down the coast, and that's where Liberia is today. So, now you know.
Any questions, comments?